Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Everson bringing you some information on Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. First, we'll talk about Samuel. Of course, these slides go along with the Samuel and Kings slides that have also been created for you. I thought it might be useful to sort of dig into these books a bit, just hitting the highlights on its central characters. Samuel, of course, is considered to be the last of the judges by some. Again, he marks the transition from the period of the judges to the period of the monarchy. Samuel, he sort of does it all, right? I guess if you can sing, act, and dance, you're a triple threat on Broadway. And Samuel, he can be a military leader, he can be a priest, he can be a prophet. And so Samuel is a remarkable person within Scripture. So he does sometimes offer up sacrifices. He does speak on behalf of God. That's what prophets do. Incidentally, the picture there is Samuel being conjured up from beyond the grave before Saul. He's being conjured by the witch of Endor. So it's a famous story within 2 Samuel. Yeah, incidentally, the mother-in-law in Bewitched is named Endora, I think, in honor of the witch of Endor, as described in the Bible. Okay, so last of the judges sometimes acts like a priest, sometimes acts like a prophet. Of course, it is Samuel who mediates Israel's search for a king. He is the go-between between God and the people. So in this sense, he's acting as a prophet. He's also acting as a leader of the people, sort of like a judge. As we said in the other slide, the verdict on the judge is the verdict on the kingship is mixed, right? This is not what God wanted for the people, but he tolerates their request. God's often described this way in the Bible, where because, for example, Moses, he says, don't destroy the Israelites. After the episode of the golden calf, don't destroy them. Think of what people will say. And God listens to the request of Moses. The people don't even repent. He listens to their requests. So this is how God's often described in the Bible. So he tolerates their request for a king, and he works through Samuel to anoint the first king. So God tolerates their request. Saul is anointed first as king. I should say something about the Hebrew term for anoint. Mashach is how you say anoint. He anointed in Hebrew. One who is anointed is known as a Mashiach. So Mashiach means anointed one. And so this is where we get the word Messiah. It's the English transliteration of the term Mashiach, means to be anointed. The Greek translation of Mashiach is Christos, which has to do with the word for oil. It's one who's anointed with oil in Greek. So incidentally, our word Crisco is related to Christos, again, which has to do with oil. I believe Crisco is dehydrogenated vegetable oil. I think that's what they call it. I don't exactly know what dehydrogenation means, and I'm pretty sure Samuel didn't either. So there you go. Saul is anointed as king. Of course, the idea of anointing is that somebody is marked in a special way. Oils in the ancient world were fragrant. They were nice. They smelled good. It was a nice gesture to use or to give oil. Oils could be, applied to a person, put on a person. They could also be burned, and they smelled good. Incidentally, in ancient Egypt, at parties, I recall one of the things they would do is they would take sort of cones of scented fat, and they would put them on the heads of ladies. And as the festivities went on through the evening, the fat would melt and the scented oil would sort of drip down, and that was very nice. People like that. So the ancient world is a different place than it is today. If you've ever been to I had a friend who converted to Catholicism, and I was at his baptism, and he was anointed with oil, and yeah, it was very fragrant, and to me it was very strange, just because you don't see this, but that's what we have going on here with Saul and David being anointed as the chosen leaders, as the messiahs of Israel. Okay, Saul as king. This might be a Rembrandt uh, painting here of Saul as David plays the harp for him. Of course, you'll have to forgive my historically inaccurate paintings that I use. You know, what can I say? I Googled Saul, and this is what I got. Saul was a successful military leader. It's important to remember this is what kings were. This is also what judges were. The difference between a judge and a king is the king had a permanent position as a military leader. Instead of being called up for a certain time to save the people, it was the king's responsibility to always be there to defend the people from foreign threats. This is central to the idea of salvation. Salvation in the Old Testament is often thought of in physical terms. You were saved from a physical threat. And I think it would be a very troubling time to live in. In the modern day and age, and I would attribute this mostly to the prevalence of resources. If you want more resources, you can do things within the market to acquire them peacefully, and you don't need to resort to violence. In the ancient world, where resources were far more scarce, there was a great deal more violence, and it was very common for people to come and use violence to take your things. So the idea that you would see a foreign group of people come in, wreak havoc and violence, destroy families, steal property, and then leave, there was a good chance of that. It happened all the time, and kings then became very popular, and they were praised and they were loved because they were the ones who saved you when the threat was coming. They marshaled the troops. They got people together. They organized the retaliation, and they went for it, and they risked their own lives in battle, and they defeated the enemy, and salvation came, and it was a very important thing. So, it's probably a good and useful thing to imagine what that world would be like, so we can better understand the world of the Old Testament. I've never lived in a war zone. I can only imagine what that would be like, and anyway. Okay, so he creates a national army, right? So he finds people that have their 24/7 job is being in the army, right? And this is you could look at a parallel with American history, with having Minutemen versus a standing army. Unimpressive kingdom. Maybe I shouldn't put it that way. The kingdom starts small. The kingdom was you have these tribes that are sort of associated loosely, or not all under one king, but they're organized ethnically and religiously. And what resources do they have? What structures do they have? What wealth do they have? They start small, and that only makes sense. I should point out that Israel starts when the neighbors aren't that impressive either. The world had seen empires before. So way back, well, probably the most famous ancient empire, or one of them, would be Hammurabi's kingdom. Of course, Hammurabi gives us his law code right from the 1700s BC. So long before Saul, you had a Babylonian empire, that stretched many, many miles. and they had seen that before. But during Saul's day, you didn't have major empires that were occupying so much territory and had so much control. And so it was a good time to become a nation in a sense, where you could sort of compete, as it were. You could establish your kingdom, establish territories, establish rule over cities, and nobody would come in and stop what you were doing, right? Hammurabi's not going to march in with his troops and say, not so fast. And so Israel becomes a nation for the first time under Saul during the time of a power vacuum in both Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Of course, Saul falls from grace, as you probably know. He was a good guy, and then he became a bad guy. You can read 1 Samuel to get a sense for how this happens. And it rings true to the human experience. You see this throughout human history, and maybe you've seen it in your own life, where people, when they come into power, of course politicians come to mind most easily for this, but people come into power, and power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as they say, and he becomes paranoid and power hungry, and he falls out of God's good graces, and so he ceases to be God's anointed. So a new king is anointed, even while he's on the throne, and of course that's David. Okay, so there's Saul. The start of his reign, I should add before we jump to the next slide here, 1025. That's a bit of a question mark. People aren't sure exactly when he started. The Hebrew on that for that discussion is actually missing. It's blank in the Masoretic text. And off the top of my head, I know the Septuagint has a date, and I'm not sure that shows up in Qumran. I could look into that though. So anyway, Saul's reign is a bit of a question mark in terms of its the chronology. David the king, he reigns from 1000 to 960. Sorry about these pictures. That's not. I mean, that's obviously not what you would call an Iron Age harp that he's playing there. I know that looks very medieval and sort of early modern. I mean, he kind of looks like a Henry VIII there, really. He's got very nice socks and a nice dress that he's wearing there. But anyway, David the king, he reigns for 40 years. So David reigns for 40, and Solomon, his son, reigns for 40. And so when you add up all of the years of the United Monarchy, you get about 100 years. Altogether, it's sort of easy to remember. David receives a good grade within the Bible. David was he was known for his military prowess. He was known for being a great warrior, and this is the reason why he's not allowed to build the temple, because of his ability with violence. Of course, this is how he sort of comes up the ranks. This is how he impresses King Saul, because he is so good at killing Philistines. I think David probably would have been a terrifying person to meet just because of this. You think of people who have been hardened by war, and they've seen a lot of violence, and it sort of I can only imagine David would have been that sort of person, where it would have been serious and intimidating to hang out with somebody who had taken so many lives. But he's also at the same time described as a man after God's own heart. I'm not sure if we've talked about this before, but in Hebrew, Lev or Levav is the word for heart, and it's with the heart that thinking is usually described. Some people say the heart is the seat of the intellect, and this isn't the Hebrew language alone that talks this way. Thinking is so when the Hebrew Old Testament talks about the heart, it's often talking about thinking, and this is an important distinction, because it's in English it's associated with emotions. I heart New York or whatever, and that's not a good translation, right? So he's somebody who thinks like God. Hebrew when they want to describe emotions, it's usually with the guts. It's down in your bowels. And Greek's the same way. Splanchnizomai is a word that comes to mind for that. If you really love somebody, you know, you you feel your love for them in your bowels. Oh, and actually, there's a word rechem in Hebrew, which is the word for womb, and it's also a word for love. So anyway, emotions are in the guts, and thinking is in the heart. And David was a man who thought like God thought. David was famous for being musical. David plays the harp. The songbook in the Old Testament is called the Psalms, and David is about half of the Psalms are attributed to David. David conquered the city of Jerusalem, and he makes it his capital. That's a very important historical event. The Jebusites were a group of folks that had control of the city up until that time. So that's, again, getting back to Joshua and the conquest. You have lots of folks who aren't Israelites who are still there. So it wasn't a wholesale genocide of the territory. Right? You've got the first chapter of Judges describing all sorts of people, and the Jebusites were some of the folks that were there. David was able to academics usually describe David sort of sneaking in through the waterway. It's hard to describe, but if you ever go to Jerusalem, you can sort of do a tour of Hezekiah's tunnel and see where they think David and his elite squad may have sort of snuck into the city to conquer it. So Jerusalem was an important city. Militarily, you can think of it as sort of a bump on the bottom of a bowl. It has valleys surrounding it, and yet Jerusalem itself is a hill, a small mountain, if you will. And it's you could see your enemies coming, and yet it was very defensible. So it's just an important military position. Of course, it's centrally located as well in terms of Israel to the north and south. So became, of course, a very important cultural center as well, as it is today. If you ever have a chance to visit Jerusalem, walking through the old city and seeing the Turkish walls and everything else, it's quite an experience. And seeing, foundations that go back to the time of Herod the Great, who ruled, around the time of the birth of Jesus. It's remarkable. Okay, anyway, moving right along. He was very successful against the Philistines. It was during the time of David that the Philistines ceased to be a threat against the Israelites. So there are 5 famous Philistine cities. See if I can remember them all. Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gezer, Gath, and Ekron. They've been excavated, and they know quite a bit about the Philistines. The Philistines were initially in Israel were a Bronze Age Greek culture that came over on ships and settled in the coastlands. And they ate a lot of pork. That's one of the things they were famous for. So they were culturally distinct from the Israelites, and they were often at odds with them. And I'm not sure when the Philistines ceased to exist as a culture. That might be debated, but I do know that they ceased being a threat for the Israelites because of David. Most of the Psalms are attributed to David. It's in the 70s. I forget if it's 74 or 77. A quick search can give you that number. But David was a great songwriter. So just a fascinating person to me, that he would be a terrifying warrior at the same time. He has a mind like God. He thinks like God, and he's also very musical. And when you read through the Psalms, you see the reflection that this sort of skill in meditation or reflection that David has, getting at very deep and profound thoughts, clearly in touch with his emotional side and grappling with all of these things. So, famous, fascinating person. Okay. Oh, and then of course the moral failure, which I shouldn't giggle about. It's a bad thing. Hopefully you're aware that this event occurred. David committed adultery. One of his soldiers named Uriah, who was a Hittite living among Israelites, was married to a woman named Bathsheba. And at a time when David should have been with his troops at war, he succumbed to temptation and had sexual relationship with Bathsheba, which resulted in pregnancy, and he had her husband killed so that he could be with her. So this is a great catastrophe in David's life. David was confronted by the prophet Nathan because of this, and that's, to me, it's very striking. David, who's very good at killing people, would you want to confront him about this terrible thing that he's done? People usually say yes to power. They usually don't challenge it. And so you got to tip your hat to Nathan for sort of doing the right thing. But yes, so this results in the death of a child, and then later the birth of Solomon by Bathsheba. Okay, then moving of Solomon. The way you say Solomon in Hebrew is Shlomo, so it's kind of a fun name. Yeah, incidentally, Greeks couldn't say sh, so every sh in Hebrew becomes an S in Greek. That's why Jesus is not Yeshu, as it is in Aramaic. He's Jesus with us. And also Greeks don't like to end names with open vowels. So Moshe becomes Moses, and Shlomo becomes Solomon. And they didn't like they called it an anaptictic vowel. They didn't like the shla consonant cluster, S-H-L, shla, all slurred together. So Shlomo becomes Solomon. Okay, moving right along. He ruled for 40 years after his father. So from 960 down to 920. Solomon becomes a wealthy king. This is one of the things that he's famous for. So when you control a large territory of land, you can extract tribute or taxes from its people. You can also control trade routes. This is how it worked in the ancient world. This is how it works today, right? This is what nations do today. So mutatis mutandis, as they say. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So he acquires a great deal of wealth. And using this wealth and forced labor, he has building projects which would be the fortification of certain cities and also the building of the temple. There's the so-called Solomonic gates. This is something archaeologists get into, but they look at certain cities, and there's a uniformity of style of fortified gates. Of course, the gate was the most important part of the city wall. It's through the gate that people enter and exit, and this is how your enemy might want to enter, because it's easier to walk through a door than it is to climb over a wall, especially if they're shooting or throwing or dumping things on you from the wall. And so I believe it's Hatzor, Gezer, and one other city where they found these similar style gates that they think date to the time of Solomon, and it's evidence of the building projects that are described in the Bible, but you can link them to physical remains that are in the earth. So this is a way of corroborating what the Bible says. The temple in Jerusalem would be the most famous building project that Solomon does. You can read about its dedication in the first part of 1 Kings. Temple it's a house for God on earth. It's the house of Yahweh, the house of the Lord. Of course, the Israelites didn't believe that it entirely contained God, but he was present in the temple in a special way, is probably the simplest way of putting it. As you see from the picture there, this is the normal. Now, this might look different than the temple in Jerusalem that you usually see portrayed. The temple as described by Josephus in the days of Jesus is the most common depiction for the temple of Jerusalem. This is how the temple in Solomon's day would have looked, a little bit different. You notice there is a wall, an enclosure that's around the temple, right? So there's sort of a court that's where access is limited. Only priests can come so close to the temple. You have an altar in front of the temple. The altars weren't inside, as some people think. The altars were outside, and you would offer up the animal sacrifices on the altar. Notice it's very large, and so you would ascend the altar and offer the sacrifice there. And in front of that, you would have a basin where drink offerings would be given. People could pour their offerings into the basin. And then within the temple, you have you have a sanctum and an inner sanctum, or you have one room that is holy, and then you have a room that's even more holy, the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, farther in, and that is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and is the Ark would function as a sort of seat. It's described as a seat for Yahweh. Okay, so the temple. He's also famous for having hundreds of wives. And one of the things kings would do in the ancient world to establish political and economic ties would be marriage. And in the ancient world, you could have multiple wives, and that would be considered a normal thing. Today, it's weird to have multiple wives for most folks in Western civilization. And so he did have many wives. Maybe he had a problem, right? The Bible doesn't portray this as a good thing, and so he might have had some addiction issues, or maybe he was power hungry, and this was a way of securing many economic and political ties with those who were around him. In any case, he's famous for having many wives. Solomon also dabbles in idolatry. He's not entirely faithful to his God. So Solomon, and of course this would go hand in hand with marrying foreign wives, just like Jezebel brought the worship of Baal to Ahab in the north. Whoever Solomon would have married that was not an Israelite, it would only make sense that she would bring her worldview with her and her worship of other gods with her as well, and Solomon succumbs to that. Solomon's also associated with wisdom. Solomon is described as a wise king, and he was gifted with wisdom by God. He almost like a special skill or ability that Solomon has. Wisdom literature in the Bible is associated with or attributed to Solomon. The books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, as they call it in Hebrew, and Song of Solomon, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. All three of these books are attributed to Solomon. And you know, the rabbis have this in the Talmud, I believe it's in the Talmud, they have this, they say that Solomon wrote Song of Songs when he was a young man and full of love and passion. He wrote the book of Proverbs when he was sitting on the throne, ruling as a wise king. And he wrote Ecclesiastes when he was an old man and became embittered and saddened by life. So I don't think that's true necessarily, but it's a useful way of remembering Solomon is the author of all three and sort of the nature of these books. Proverbs having traditional wisdom, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Ecclesiastes having non-traditional wisdom, bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. And the Song of Songs being a book of love poetry. Okay, well that's all I have for you on the United Monarchy. Hope you're all doing well.